Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Exchange Podcast. My name is Zach Rhoads. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Stanton Peele. Stanton is a psychologist, an author, and a true pioneer in the field of addiction and social psychology. He's also a great friend and colleague. Stanton and I are in the process now of publishing a developmental model of addiction, both for adults and children. So, we both became interested when recently we read a statement from the World Health Organization declaring that they now identify gaming as an addiction, one that must include many American children. So we thought this was funny in a way, a little disturbing in others. So on one hand, for the past 40 years, Stanton has been trying to teach the public that anything can become an addiction. It's not limited to drugs, so you'd think he'd be happy, because now the DSM identifies a non-drug addiction, gambling, although gambling is the only thing that they call addiction. And now the World Health Organization is calling gaming an addiction. And therein lives the irony, because at long last, we widely recognize not just drug, but process or behavioral addictions, but we're taking really bizarre and possibly destructive steps in doing so. So Dr. Peele and I thought we would take some time to tell you about our thoughts on behavioral and process addictions like gaming, and the way we approach such problems. We talk specifically about Stanton's Life Process Program, which is a non-AA, non-12-step program for people involved in an addictive process, whatever the severity, be it to drugs, alcohol, gambling, eating, pornography, sex, whatever. I work with him in that program, which makes it easy to have a back and forth in that respect for both of us. And we also talk about how our approach in addressing addictions relates to our developmental model and our developmental approach at dealing with kids and adults. And given the current hype, we talk a whole lot about gaming in this talk. Gaming addiction, and what that even means, and the best ways to address the problem by our way of thinking. We know that talk of addictions to gaming and technology even is a hot topic in the news right now, and it's bound to get even more media attention as time goes on. And there is bound to be mythology and misconception and confusion to go along with it, so we hope that we can help you clear up any confusion about this phenomenon and give you a feel for what our work together looks like. If you would like to know more about the Life Process Program, which you will hear more about in the talk, you can go to lifeprocessprogram.com, and you can find that link and relevant information in the description below the talk. You may also check out links provided to some of Stanton's books, one of which is called Addiction Proof Your Child, and you can find that in the description as well. Now enough from me. I hope you'll enjoy my talk with Dr. Stanton Peele. Welcome, this is Zach Rhoads, and joining me for a conversation today is a psychologist, author, and the creator of the Life Process Program, Dr. Stanton Peele. Stanton, thank you so much for joining me again.
It's my pleasure, Zach.
We're recording this conversation for a new podcast I've created called The Social Exchange. While my expertise lies in the field of human development, as well as now addiction, this show is an attempt to open the borders of my standard addiction conversations to a variety of social issues that embody it. We're going to talk today about technology and gaming. For all the joy and comfort and convenience that we get from technology and social media, cell phones, video games, it's now widely recognized that, quote, excessive use of technology can cause quite serious harms. So, for instance, the World Health Organization, as I mentioned in the introduction, recently introduced gaming addiction as a sort of disorder. Stanton, the idea that an involvement with something other than drugs can be an addiction, well, that's nothing new to us, especially not you. You've been saying this for over 40 years in print. And I think you and I will agree that, of course, gaming or any involvement with the use of technology, for that matter, can become an addiction. Now, as much as the media and now even health organizations, they're spreading a meme that gaming is a new concept, I believe that the organization that you started, the Life Process Program, is and has always been prepared to offer education and support around potentially harmful involvements to things like gaming. And for those who don't know, Stanton has hired me to do work as a coach in his life process program, which we'll talk a little bit about. Stanton, I know that's a lot to unpack, but before we talk about the life process program, remind us what addiction is from your point of view.
Well, starting back with love and addiction in 1975, Archie Brodsky and I identified that people become addicted to an experience. That originated what is now called the concept of addiction to a process, or addiction as a process. It's not the object of the addiction that determines a person's likelihood or involvement in an addiction. It's the process by which they become engaged in an experience as a way of dealing with their lives. Therefore, it shifts our focus entirely away from chemical sources of addiction. It's not some molecule. It's not some chemical structure that locks into our brain that makes us addicted. It's the way that we turn to heroin, perhaps, or painkillers in general, or any kind of a substance, or any kind of an engaging experience as a way of resolving emotional issues that we have, as satisfying our anxieties, our depression, at giving us a feeling that somehow we're worthwhile. That creates the link that becomes addictive. With that basic framework in mind, my work in the decades since then, leading up to the life process program, has been how do we engage people in dealing with that kind of an addiction? We in the life process program deal with that by first identifying that the addiction is not an overwhelming disease, by making clear that the addiction does not stem from a chemical, but rather comes from the life space of an individual. The needs that they have, that they generate, that they can't fill in any other way than by resorting to the addiction. So our definition of addiction is any kind of an experience or process in which a person becomes engaged in order to fulfill emotional and identifying self needs that has the kickback effect of detracting from their ability to deal with the rest of their life, so that they become more and more dependent on that activity or experience, is or can be an addiction. When you look at addiction in that framework, it becomes instantly clear that the greatest need is to enable a person to enhance their life space and life gratification, to be able to find a better source for the needs that they're trying to fulfill through the addiction in the normal course of their life. And that's what we do in the life process program. At the same time as we identify what kinds of satisfactions they gain from the addictive experience and where we need to look for them to find other kinds of experiences. Tuning in now to the World Health Organization finally identifying gaming as an addiction or as a disorder allows us to focus on one of the largest and most apparent forms of addiction-related kinds of activities, which is people becoming entirely engaged in electronics. And this is something that has special significance for children and parents. You and I are very reluctant to label kids with any kind of disorder, and it's certainly not appropriate to declare a person has an addiction, certainly never a lifelong addiction. But we can see, and parents are highly concerned about children who are so tuned into games that they become incapable of dealing with ongoing life issues, making friends, going outside and exercising, to the point where it detracts from their schoolwork. And this is so evident. It's so hard to imagine that it could be overlooked, although in fact, the American Psychiatric Association, in its most recent diagnostic manual, DSM-5, failed to identify gaming as an addiction. It identified one thing as being addictive, and that was gambling. it put gaming on the shelf to be looked at further. And the World Health Organization has taken the plunge of making clear that this is a disorder. And this is something that we're prepared to engage with parents through the Life Process program.
When it comes to drugs or even involvements like gambling, organizations like the World Health Organization or National Institute of Health talk about addiction, as you say, as a brain disease that must be maintained while remaining abstinent sometimes is the appropriate measure to take. I think they view technology a little bit differently. They have to, because it's hard to imagine requiring all people with addictive involvements with technology to remain abstinent from gaming. And that's something you just touched on too. Computers, phones, you name it. And some people, even if they're not supposed to be playing video games, even if that's part of their quote-unquote program, they're going to find a way. So if you sign on the dotted line for the disease model, when it comes to gaming or technology, the whole thing is a bit of a mess. While on the other hand, addressing such problems as part of a lifelong process is exactly in the wheelhouse of the Life Process program. Maybe you could describe that approach somewhat.
What has always made clear that the disease theory makes no sense is its absolute ban on any related kind of activity to the addiction. And that's true both, of course, in the AA model, but also it's true in the neo disease model, the brain disease model. But that has never made sense. Experiments show that if people accidentally taste alcohol after they've quit alcohol because they decide they're an alcoholic, it doesn't cause them instantly to relapse. With narcotics, is it really true? This is a question I always ask people who claim that they were born to be addicted to opioids or narcotics, that they can never really have another painkiller in the course of their lives. If they go to the hospital and they've had a knee replacement or an appendicitis, they're really going to avoid entirely painkillers? And then they'll usually shake their heads and say, well, no, not exactly. With other kinds of activities that are recognized as process addictions. And by the way, the Life Process program and you and I, Zach, we don't call certain addictions process addictions as though that's a different kind of addiction.
Right.
We mean all addictions break down to that fundamental process by which a person turns to an experience to fulfill basic needs in a way, including feeling okay about themselves, in a way that detracts from their ability to generate those kinds of feelings on their own. And in areas like food addiction, shopping addiction, gambling addiction perhaps, and certainly gaming and electronics, the possibility of absolute abstinence is ludicrous. It's not desirable, it's not possible, it's crazy. And people recognize that, and they try to manipulate the concept of the brain disease so as to make it possible to accept this large add-on to the disease model. That when your life space changes, when your sense of yourself changes, when how you view the addiction changes, when under varying circumstances you encounter the addictive episode or experience again, now you'll be able to manage it in a sufficiently positive way. Of course, that's doubly and triply true when the person we're talking about is a young person, a child especially. Things that are overwhelming that people can't deal with as children, they come to grips with as they mature, as they get a sense of themselves, certainly later in life when they become a stable adult. And that has to be the truth and the case with electronics and with gaming. And I know you have come to this same area from a different direction, working with parents and children. You've had to identify for the parents what to do with a child who becomes preoccupied with gaming in a way that doesn't rule electronics out of their lives entirely.
Right. So I wanted to share something with you that was, I have notes that I wrote for a group of parents from about 6 years ago. So this is before you and I met, before you helped me realize that the process of development has a lot to say about the process of addiction. In many ways, they are inextricably linked. So I have this little list of, suggestions or urgements that I've made for parents here that I think are interestingly tied to this concept. And so I'll go through them. And this list has to do with gaming. So parents asking me, hey, my kids are over involved with things like video games or technology. What do I do? I had no concept of a disease. The concept of a disease had never even been introduced to me. So this is how I sort of came up with it intuitively. The first thing I told parents to do is acknowledge the benefits of the technology. So if your kid is, quote, overusing it, some sort of technology, and you think it's become something of a problem, I say keep an open dialogue with your kids about their general needs and wants and goals, and ask, how do you use technology to your advantage in that respect? Be honest about the positives that the technology gives. How would that relate to the Life Process program and kind of a step to...
Well, as you know, being a coach in the Life Process program, if you don't think of an addiction as a brain disease, the first question you ask is, why is the person, why are you, the client, engaged in this experience? And the quickest way to get to that question is to say, well, what does it do for you? Why do you do it? You can even put it as, what benefits do you get from it? They're seeking something from that thing. And of course, when you talk to a parent, you can get them to reflect on what is it the child gets from that experience. It's not magic. It's ironic that something that we label as being a modern science and claim the brain disease as an example of is so magical. Well, they just become addicted to it. They're born that way. They have a gene that makes them, which makes no sense whatsoever with gaming. And so in your logical, rational, problem-solving approach with human beings, including children and parents, you came to exactly the same place that we start out with in the Life Process program by rejecting the inanity that people have a disease that makes them addicted to something.
By the way, I think that one reason that we have not historically called things like gaming or involvements with technology addictions, and why I'm still hesitant to call it that, is because as a child, you are dependent on your parents or adults for a number of things, including navigating the process of life. So when I say to something about gaming to parents, first acknowledge the benefits, I don't get pushback like I might get pushback if I ask them to, say, acknowledge the benefits of some sort of drugs or smoking or something like that. Because one of the reasons I think is because parents know that asking a child to be completely abstinent of something like playing a video game or being on technology, as you said earlier, is ludicrous, and there's almost no way to navigate that system. The second thing that I tell people to do, once you've opened that dialogue and created a relationship, just acknowledge that, hey, you're not crazy. Obviously, you're getting some sort of benefit out of this process, is to clearly but collaboratively set limits, because that's what parents can do. So set limits on technology. Kids are dependent on us for about everything, including boundaries. And we often ignore this with respect to social media, but we shouldn't. How would you say clearly and collaboratively setting limits ties into the Life Process approach?
Well, at first I want to identify how you and I are working on a developmental model of addiction as applied to both adults and children. And the development model is so obvious with children, although it's often being rejected now, where people are sent to AA. Well, for example, Drew Barrymore identified as an addict when she was 12 years old, and now she's a famous actress and Hollywood producer. But when you're dealing with a child, you recognize that they have the ability to develop beyond where they are currently. And so that's something that has to be imported, as you described, when you're talking to people about addictions, like the idea that they're seeking some kind of and getting some kind of a benefit from it. And another thing that comes naturally to you from your developmental approach is collaboration. The standard addiction disease model involves, like any kind of medical diagnosis, saying, oh, look, you have this disease. But that's not how you arrive at a positive way of identifying a problem and moving forward on a problem in relationship to activities. You need to have the person themselves, or in this case, the child themselves, clamor on to where you want to go, have to feel for themselves that they have a better way of satisfying their needs. And very often that's labeled, when a person refuses to participate in your helping them around an activity, that's labeled as denial by the person. That's what a crazy idea. Denial is a characteristic of a medical brain disease. Really, it's a problem of working with the person to allow them to see a better way forward. And obviously, in the case of gaming, you're not going to sell a child on the idea that they're never going to play another electronic game. Just as it makes no sense to tell somebody when they're 12 or 14 or 16, like Drew Barrymore, that they're never going to drink or take a drug again. By the way, in fact, Drew Barrymore now has her own winery. Instead, making people realize that this is something that they can encapsulate in their lives, that they can control, certainly when they're young people, certainly with an activity like shopping or eating or electronics that they're going to have to incorporate into their lives, that this is something that's got to be managed within boundaries. And in our work, both yours and mine, with children, where the approach that we're describing might strike some people as being entirely permissive, you're not ruling out drinking or even drugs or games from the person's life forever. In fact, we're a little bit old-fashioned in terms of setting values and standards that include responsibility and boundaries. These are things that human beings, certainly young people, need to incorporate in their lives in order to manage powerful experiences that we're all exposed to, like electronic games.
I think there's somewhat of a discussed feature, and maybe it is actually a bug, not a feature to us in some respects, that circles around when we talk about drugs, that doesn't when we talk about things like gaming or technology or any other behavior that is ubiquitous. So you're getting into, after I've told parents, and this is, by the way, a pretty successful routine that I've developed, like a well-oiled machine, after they've had the conversation, hey, what benefits are you getting from technology? Hey, what are some criteria for limit setting? Let's see when you shouldn't use it. I have them support and suggest other healthy involvements in collaboration with the kid that provide that same satisfaction in a healthy way, and which help the kids achieve their goals, and continue to allow the use of technology when it's truly useful, and teaching kids the difference and letting them run the experiment and even make mistakes in the real world.
That kind of collaboration is an exact description, of course, of motivational interviewing and of how we approach situations with clients in the life process program. After we ask them what the benefits they achieve are, we never label them. We don't have the job of telling them they're addicted or that they're an alcoholic, as the case may be. We ask them, tell us what kinds of problems you're encountering in life and how are those linked to the drug or the substance or the activity. And then we ask the question collaboratively, well, what directions can we go in to reduce, limit the kinds of problems that you're experiencing? In general, they're going to involve less use of something, less resort to something, and more exposure to positive kinds of alternatives. That's so clear in the case with parents and children who are using games as a refuge in life, as a turning away from other kinds of things, that the parent sees that pretty quickly, and even the child knows that. Even a child recognizes that they would be happier with friends, participating in sports, doing better in school. Once you lower the defense level, once you say, well, let's work together to make you a happier person, to enjoy your own life more, that's something that's obviously applicable in developmental work with children, and it's equally obvious and applicable in addiction as we apply it in the life process program.
Well, then we get into the toughest realm for kids and adults alike, with involvements that have the potential to becoming destructive and trying to work on a way to get on the positive side of the balancing act. And that is, once you've decided on some basic boundaries for yourself and you're going and trying to run that experiment in society, I think the toughest goal, and this was certainly true for when I'm working with parents, and what makes me, I think, hireable, is actually advocating for your kid in collaboration with the rest of society. So in terms of parents and kids that I work with, anybody can make rational goals and a framework for goals. What's tough is actually getting out there and the goals that you decide to use as a parent, how to apply those in a setting for school, how to get teachers involved and to sign on the dotted line, or administrators or anybody else in society or peers. So I think that collaboration with the rest of the world is the tough racket. How do we make that work in the Life Process program?
In the Life Process program, we're talking about renegotiating how you deal with the world around you. You're describing the same process with children. Once we identify what that is, it makes it clearer what needs to be done, but it doesn't make it simpler. And for one thing, we need to encourage people and give them the confidence that they're going to be able to do that. Once again, that's something that's clearer, and in a sense, it's more evident and easier with children to identify that as being the problem. But your problem often, and I'm aware of some of your cases, is in dislabeling people. Once children have this kind of identity, not only a label that's been applied to them by other people, but they start seeing themselves in these terms on their own, their ability to exceed the boundaries becomes so much harder. They explain to you why they can't do something. Well, I have this disability that means I'll never be able to learn something, or I'm too nervous to deal with people or the world outside them. It's not our job, of course, to argue with them. It's our job to encourage them and to lower their anxiety levels so that they can actually start, like you described, experimenting with life and starting to get real and positive feedback. So that kind of negotiation is something that with a child, I know from cases you've dealt with, you often have to be their advocate to the world. Occasionally, sometimes even with parents, negotiate this strange deal of explaining to them, well, your child's not really forever limited. Your child isn't really totally identified by this label or this disorder. There's something that goes beyond that.
Well, so you know of a couple cases that I've been able to share. And I guess what happens, Stanton, is the same thing that seems to happen in this dichotomy that we deal with in the world of drugs when we talk about addiction, the disease versus moral kind of dichotomy, that I think it's a false one. It happens that when a kid is introduced to a program, or oftentimes to me when I'm working privately, is the kid has been labeled as something, not as a diagnostic criteria, but just labeled kind of a jerk or aggressive or something like that, as if inborn in the child is this temperamental trait to want to, cause harm. And so I think the road is paved with the greatest intentions when those kids come into contact with, say, a school psychologist who says, no, this is not a bad kid. This is somebody who has, ADHD, or this is somebody who has a severe trauma. And so the toughest thing for me to do is to try to acknowledge the generosity and the warmth that people are showing when trying to give this label to a child, while also trying to, in real time, show the harms associated with labeling a child, because they can't seem to make progress if you tell them there's some threshold that they cannot cross. So maybe you could describe just briefly whether you think that adding a criteria to, say, gambling, saying that now gambling is something that is in and of itself, I'm sorry, not gambling, I mean gaming, in and of itself addictive, is that going to feed into this problem where we are labeling people unnecessarily?
Well, you and the other coaches in the Life Process program show, and I've selected and work with all of you on the basis that you have the humanity to tell people, relax. If you have problems, I've had problems too. Maybe not exactly the same problem that you had, but I accept your basic value and I want you to do well. People have sometimes grasped onto disease labels as a way of lowering their own negative feelings about themselves or their anxieties about themselves. But it's a morass. It's a tar pit that traps them in those feelings. A better way to get around that is to say to them, look, I feel you're fine. The fact that you have one or another problem that others have been sensitized to doesn't mean that you're not basically worthwhile. It's our job together to talk about the good strengths, the strengths that you have, and to make clear to other people, including sometimes yourself, just what value you add to situations. And I know you take a strength-based approach to children and also to addiction. So in both of these approaches, what we're doing is allowing people to engage in life directly, to experience the rewards for themselves of seeing them in a more positive light. And that's the way that children certainly need to go forward, but also within the life process program that people need to progress.
So getting back to gaming specifically, it turns out then, with this all as a framework, that gaming is inextricably linked to technology as a whole, and the pattern of behavior that underlying the use of technology, with the potential to become an addiction, is the same pattern of behavior underlying involvements with anything and everything, all of which have some potential to become addictive. But it's not the thing or involvement itself that is in and of itself addictive. And understanding that framework, I would say, is crucial for disentangling problems that come bundled with addiction. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I've noted DSM-3, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, in 2013, had these great publicized debates about what should be called addictive. They rejected sex and love relationships as being potentially addictive for reasons that are just kooky. They claim that people don't show their correct brain waves when they claim to be sexually addicted, even if it engulfs their lives in a totally negative way in their involvements with others. They decided one single human activity can be addictive, other than involving substances, and that's gambling. And they put gaming on the shelf for the World Health Organization to come to bring it off the shelf and say, well, look, this can be addictive. The whole enterprise of saying this is addictive or this isn't addictive, it's just psychotic. It just makes no sense at all, because we all know many people who take painkillers or who drink who don't become addicted. We all know many people who involve themselves in electronics or play electronic games and they don't become addicted. How can we say the addiction is that thing? Mishigas, to use a technical term of creating columns of things that are addictive and not addictive, is the transition that DSM-3 hasn't been able to make, that the life process program has made, and which many people understand really in their own lives. Addiction isn't a thing, it's how they engage or relate to a thing. And so you're right, it seems crazy once again to say, well, look, what do we do about the fact that the World Health Organization has said gaming is the source of a disorder, is addictive? Does that mean we avoid it entirely? Of course, we don't avoid alcohol or painkillers or opioids entirely. The answer then becomes, how do people manage and set boundaries for that relationship? How do people approach these things in a way where they're not so afraid that it'll totally overcome them, that it makes it more likely that it'll overcome them? And how, and this is the complicated question, obviously, it's a can of worms that's been opened up. How do we enable people in the world and young people today to find that there's enough satisfaction out there for them that they're not inclined to become addictively engaged with sex, drugs, alcohol, games, shopping, or any of those potential addictive involvements? And if I had to give one quick answer to that, if there's one ideal that parents and adults, teachers and counselors should shoot for, it's to have people be mindful, awake to the here and now. And I know you've developed a mindfulness program with, in fact, one of your young charges or clients, where people welcome newness and novelty and challenges and look to the world as providing them with positive options. That the single best answer for how does a person overcome addiction, how does a young person overcome addiction or avoid addiction, is to see life in overwhelmingly positive terms as offering them advantages to become involved in.
Yeah, you and I have both noted that there's a big difference between trying to maintain a mess in your life versus moving forward on a positive trajectory in life. So the Martin Seligman quote that I've seen before and I love is that when we're in bed at night thinking about what we want for ourselves and our loved ones, we're not thinking about how to get from -3 to -2. We're often thinking about how to get from 2 to 3. And so that comes into play here. I think we should put it on the table when we talk about an interesting phenomenon of technology in general. We are now at a moment in history where we are all engulfed in social media and technology, and perhaps this is a talk for a different time when we have more time to get to it. But it does open the question, what then do we do when there's something like social media, iPhones? You mentioned the travel that you took on the subway the other day, and virtually everybody was sitting down in front of their screens and not making contact with other human beings. There's a sort of a ubiquitous problem of the lack of connection, and we're all doing it. How do you break into something that widespread?
Well, you and I work with individuals and sometimes potentially groups, and just to identify the fact that something can be addictive, and that doesn't prove it's inevitably addictive, and the alternative is to find satisfaction in life, is one way to go. But your new program, your new podcast is geared towards looking at the larger social context. And the question becomes, what do we do in a world where so many people have so few intimate contacts, are so little a part of a community, that their iPhone becomes their window to the world, their best way of communicating feelings, and sometimes with other people? I actually have the annoying habit of talking to people in the street and on the subway. To me, it's a great laboratory, and it's a great opportunity to just meet people that I wouldn't ordinarily meet. That didn't used to be such an uncommon activity. By the way, somebody actually did an experiment on the Chicago subways or elevated trains, where they said, talk to the person next to you, no matter who they are, no matter how unlike you they are. In these kinds of experiments, you usually get a significant difference where 40% of people said, I had this reaction, and 20% of people had a different reaction in a different circumstance. Every single person in that experiment who talked to somebody on the subway next to them reported that it was a positive experience. Human beings are social animals who yearn to be in contact with other people. What do we do with a world where that increasingly becomes channeled into an electronic device? And people are now becoming alarmed at what's been evident from the start, that iPhones are incredibly engulfing of people's entire lives. You're talking about, I took a snapshot on the subway, hopefully I won't get arrested, of 6 women of varying sizes and ethnicities and backgrounds, all of them staring into their iPhones, none of them interacting with one another. And that becomes a tremendously large cultural problem, and it's one that translates down to children. How in this world can people learn to engage with other human beings and with life when so many people are insulated against it? I was just talking with a grandfather, a man I admire for his liveliness, and he describes interacting with his 3-year-old. He said, well, I take him out to the park and we just walk through a path. Or when I'm in his house, he lives in Cleveland, I take him out for breakfast. What simple, silly activities those are. But all of them, both of those, involve being engaged in the world in an outward-looking fashion where you're going to interact with other people and encounter new things in a protected environment with his grandfather in a way that the child learns brings satisfaction to them. That's an immense question. We're not going to solve what Apple itself is now recognizing as the iPhone addiction problem without making some dent in society's ability to allow people to find community and warmth and interaction with other human beings. Those are experiences that can't be replaced, that we have to think about on a societal level.
Yeah, I get worried about starting to get too specific with labeling addictions to things like gaming or offshoots of a larger technological and social problem, just for the very reason that because when we talk about this whole thing, we have stuff like social media, Twitter, Facebook, and instead of being like a text message, you used to have that phone that you could call somebody or you could send them a text, and texting wasn't so engulfing because that at least was like a one-to-one contact, though it's passive. Now it's you are one to many, and your incentive is not to be social in the way that human beings are social. So nobody in their right mind is going to say, though, that the answer to this is to take away all iPhones. It just is an inherently failed enterprise if that's what you're going to try to do. And to be frank, I hope that people are listening in to this show and to us talking right now on their iPhones or on their devices. So it just goes to show that we need to acknowledge that there's a problem, acknowledge that there are benefits and reasons why people use technology, and even if we don't like them, we don't say the world should be this way, let's make it so. We say this is the way that the world is. How do we solve a problem, or how do we make it the best we possibly can?
I think we're also suggesting a kind of a criterion. It's dangerous to only have a single criterion. You're not an alcoholic because of how many days in the week you drink, but because of how it engulfs your experience. But when your primary or sole means of communicating with other human beings is by mailing out broadcasts on Facebook, when you don't have individual communications of any kind, even within Facebook or email, and certainly without face-to-face contact with another human being, then you're shifting over to a detachment from life, which can be called addictive. And people do apply the label of addiction to Facebook, where they generate anxieties about not being liked, and then they send out more messages on their Facebook page, hoping to get that experience. The single criterion that you could use in your own life or when thinking about your child is what percentage of their contact with other human beings is direct on an individual to individual basis. And you might think about this in terms of dealing with your own child. And what percentage of it is broadcast in a way that doesn't really matter that they have any kind of a relationship. And returning once again to the Life Process Program, we're extremely engaged in the idea, as you are when you work with parents and children, with the kinds of relationships that people have with those nearest and dearest to them, with how involved with others they are, with creating intimacy, with communicating their needs in a way so as to be able to escape addictive searches for meaning. In a way, all addiction and child development theory and therapy is a question of dealing with other human beings, with achieving intimacy, and with creating community.
As much as we hate, don't want to limit criteria to any one specific thing, at the Life Process Program, we do open it up to people's specific concerns. So should somebody have a worry that their child is involved in something like gaming to such an extent that it seems destructive or potentially destructive in the rest of their lives, the Life Process Program is equipped to help and educate those people. Will you explain how?
Well, in dealing with addictions, we don't generally deal with children. People can only sign up for the Life Process Program if they're an adult, obviously, and have a credit card or PayPal account. So we're moving in a new direction, as you describe, in dealing with gaming concerns the parents have for their children, where the children will be involved either directly or indirectly, but we're dealing primarily with parents, which you often have to do or want to do as a part of your work with children. And we then prepare them to recognize and deal with and communicate with their children, to become counselors of their own type. One of the exercises that we have in the Life Process Program is making people coaches themselves, teaching them, as you've described, how to collaborate with others, how to ask people questions, how to elicit from them, other people in their lives, their concerns, their emotional needs. And in a way, we're preparing parents to be coaches themselves with their own children around something that looms as addiction-like in their child's lives. It's a direction that is part of the Life Process program already, but that we're creating a new spotlight for around, as you began our podcast, the recognition by the World Health Organization that gaming is something that can achieve and is now recognized as achieving the level of a disorder on its own.
So we're running short on time now. I think maybe you could bring us to a close in summary, and if we were going to use this last bit as sort of a soundbite, beyond what you've already described pretty eloquently, what do you hope people got out of this conversation today? The new diagnosis, let's say, or criteria for gaming addiction or gaming disorder, and what the Life Process program can do in order to provide solutions?
Ideally, by labeling and thinking of addiction in a human size as something, a problem with human dimensions, we don't encourage denial. We don't discourage people about their own potential. Instead, we open up their minds and their lives to creative and positive ways of thinking about approaching and remedying problems that they already feel and know that they have. We use diagnosis. We don't diagnose. We collaboratively work with people in thinking about their problems in a way that enlarges the scope of their vision. It doesn't entail burrowing into their lives and themselves and thinking only of their own past and their supposed biology. We're an awareness, mindfulness, opening up kind of a program as the best approach for dealing with both addiction and childhood problems.
So if people want to learn more, read literature, or sign up to receive education or support via the Life Process program, the website is www.lifeprocessprogram.com. Anywhere else that you think people should go for resources, or is that pretty all-encompassing, would you say?
Well, I do have a number of books they could look at. I've written Love and Addiction and Diseasing of America, 7 Tools to Beat Addiction, and most recently with Ilsa Thompson, I wrote Recover, which is a way of embodying mindfulness, some psychological versions and Buddhist versions into your life. And those are also available on Amazon. So as well as a pamphlet called The Addiction Experience, and as well as Addiction Proofing Your Child, another pamphlet. So be alert to those, my Amazon page, and keep tuned into the work that you and I are doing in creating other kinds of writing, like a developmental approach to addiction.
And of course, I'll keep people up to speed on that. Hey, Stanton, it's been pretty cool to take an anxiety-provoking topic and a ubiquitous one, and to talk about it rationally and kind of take a breath on a Sunday morning and be able to have a logical conversation about it. I appreciate you coming on again and speaking with me.
And it's a great pleasure working with you across our own age difference and our own approaches to addiction coming from different directions. Thanks so much for allowing me to share.
Again, folks, this is Dr. Stanton Peele. My name is Zach Rhoads. We were talking about the Life Process program at lifeprocessprogram.com. See you next time.